you so much, and thanks for having me. And it's so great to see a full house for a talk like this. Before I start, I just have to apologise about the comment about disenchanted planners and architects. I accidentally said it on a radio interview last week, and one of my board members said, "You really shouldn't call yourselves that, it's not great." And I'm like, no one really listens to the radio at 6 in the morning, and here it is turning up again tonight. So please don't quote it, don't tweet it. We're not calling ourselves that anymore. So first, what I'm just going to do is explain a little bit about CoDesign Studio and who we are. I'm a qualified landscape architect and urban designer, and I've got about 14 years experience, mostly as a consultant, but also in local government, working in that space, right across different regions of the world, but mostly in Brisbane and Melbourne. And our team is a team of 15 people, but we have a real mix of architects, town planners. We've got a theatre set designer, a philosopher, a transport planner, a whole lot of community development backgrounds. And we've all come into the team really passionate about making better cities. And from whichever industry we were from, we were perhaps frustrated with a lot of strategy writing and reports, and what actually happens on the ground is quite different. And so that's what's brought us together. And so we are also a not-for-profit, and we operate as a social enterprise, as Greg said. And what that means is we have a very complicated reporting structure, but that's not for you to worry about. But it means that we're eligible for grants. And so what we do with our work is we have our communities work, where we're able to secure grants to lead research into what we see as gaps in knowledge. And then we raise revenue as well by using those tools and resources to consult to primarily local governments, but also developers and landowners to talk about how they can better, mostly about inspiring and empowering citizens to shape their own neighbourhoods. That's the space we really work in. So we call ourselves a placemaking consultancy, which is really just a buzz term at the moment that you may or may not know, but that's the space that we work in. So what I'm going to do, just to explain what all that means, is quickly share a story of one of our projects. This is a laneway space in Melbourne. Melbourne has a lot of laneway spaces. And if you know your laneways, you might know that the suburb of Brunswick has the world's largest network of bluestone laneways, 64 kilometres of them through the back streets. It's not a very dense neighbourhood. There's not a lot of development pressure there, but it's a real mix of retail and residential as well. These laneway spaces, because they're so large and very expensive to maintain, because they're all bluestone and quite difficult to improve, there's a lot of challenges, and especially a perceived safety issue. And council gets a lot of pressure from the local community to fix these places. And tragically, about 2 years ago, a young woman was abducted in one of these spaces and later on was murdered. And so a lot of conversation from the community to the council saying we need CCTV, we need gates in these spaces, we need to sterilise them and make them safe. And so council started to asphalt over them and clean off the graffiti and open them up and sort of sterilise them. And members of the community said, this can't be the way that you make these spaces safe. You know, this is making them impersonal and just making them roads. And the local residents thought that there's got to be a better way to do this. And so they approached us, and we secured a grant with them from the Department of Justice, actually, a state government down in Melbourne. And we worked with initially just the 5 people who'd approached us and thought, let's have a broader conversation with your neighbours, the other traders in the street, the residents, and see what everyone else thinks about these spaces and if there's another way to fix this problem. Recognising that it was a perceived safety problem, perhaps more so than an actual problem. And so what we started to do, we use a prototyping methodology for most of our work. We went out into the street, and we didn't have a permit to do this, but it's just chalk, so that's okay. And so we spray chalked that most of this was in private land into these laneway spaces. And just by being in this space, and this is the great thing about this photo, a lot of other people stopped and said, what are you doing? And we said, we're here to talk about these spaces. Do you want to be part of the conversation? And we ended up running, I think, 4 or 5 of these workshops in the laneway space. And each time it got bigger and bigger, and more people came along. And this is a block of land which opened out onto the laneway that the woman who owned the site said, we're going to redevelop this eventually, but at the moment we don't need it. I'm just going to open it up onto the laneway. She'd met the neighbours by this point. There was a youth drop-in centre across the laneway space, and they were perhaps the source of some of the perceived safety issue, the young people using the laneway. But having met them and talked to them, and this is all catered by the local residents, none of this is from the money that we got from the department, that they met each other, and all these really interesting projects started to come out of it. And we were having conversations about what do you want for these spaces and how could you use these as public spaces. And this is an illustration of Brunswick's a very hipster area in Melbourne. not all of Melbourne's hipster, but this is particularly hipster. And what started to happen was the traders, unsolicited from us, the traders were getting on board and promoting it through their networks and catering it and coming out and being part of the conversation. And this all started to happen really organically. And all these transformation projects started to take shape once the neighbours got to know each other and were creating a shared vision for this space. So this is that vacant piece of land, and what we ended up spending the $5,000 on was relocating the fence. You can see the new fence there, which now puts that piece of land into the laneway. So from the beginning, when we're looking at how to make these laneways safer, adding more vacant land to it probably wouldn't have been on the agenda right from the beginning, but this is what came out of the project. And this is now turned into a community garden, which is used by the Youth Drop-In Centre in that space. The space is now a really active, important part of the Brunswick area. And it actually, somebody has created a TripAdvisor page for it, which is a great barometer for success. This screenshot's from a little while ago, but you know, it's become really quite quickly entrenched into the Brunswick vernacular, this space, and it's because it feels authentic and the community created it and are championing it. And it also got some media, and we thought must be a really slow news week for the national news to be picking up on this little laneway project. But the interest that our organisation got after this and the comments on this forum really showed to us that this resonates with so many communities. People want the opportunity to do this kind of thing, and this is what a common thread we see through a lot of our work. And all of it was done in less than 90 days for under $5,000 for materials, and that was just that fence. And this is success without a master plan. And so it's just, there are lots of different time scales and financial scales you can think out when you're thinking about changing a city. And so I'm going to take a side step for a minute and just talk about the way we currently make and manage our cities. And of course, you're all in the room today, so you're probably more well-versed than many people out there. But if we go back to a hypothetical before, in city making, you know, we don't have cities like this in Australia. This is perhaps a European city that was much more incrementally developed, and a big focus, of course, before cars on streets and public spaces. But the most interesting thing about this time is that citizens were city makers, and people were much more active in that making process. And I was sharing the story, of course, with Greg before. My grandfather was a school principal, and he was involved in the designing and the funding and the building of the school buildings. That's something that used to happen, and people played a much more active role in making their cities. And there's lots of reasons that doesn't happen anymore, or doesn't happen as much as it used to, and there's a lot of pressures now that as populations and urban densities grow that we didn't have back then. And now, of course, town planning is an industry, and things tend to be quite government or development-led, and there's large tract redevelopment at once. And it's not to say that this is a problem, but it's a complete shift in the way cities are made and managed. And so the dynamic that this leaves us with is, if we boil it down to the three entities of a city, we've got the local authority, whether it be a local council or the state government or whoever it might be, the citizens and the physical space. And what we've created is a dynamic where the authorities ask and inform the community and then have the burden of doing it all themselves. And there's a complete disconnect between what the citizens' role in that process is. And so what if we're thinking, how do we unlock that? How do we put communities in the driver's seat in some ways with some of these decisions, like the Brunswick Laneways project? And so when we look at what this dynamic is creating in our cities, there's all sorts of literature out there about loneliness and what that's doing to our societies. And although we're living closer together, there's less number of people per dwelling these days on average, but loneliness is now emerging as a really significant health concern, and it's outstripping all sorts of other things like heart disease and alcohol abuse, and this is something we do a lot of work with Vic Health, because they're looking at addressing these things through social connection. If you also look at statistics about who knows their neighbour, this is a horrifying statistic to me. 1 in 3 Australians don't know any neighbours. Like, isn't that ridiculous that we live in cities like this, we're closer together, but people don't know the people that they might share a wall with or live in the same apartment building with? And this really scares me, this kind of statistic. And so when you think about what it takes to make a great place, I suppose that there are two components to that. There's the hardware, which is the buildings and the setbacks and the heights and the roads, and that's very important, of course, and it takes a lot of time to build and plan and a lot of technical nous in getting this stuff right. But equally important, I would say, is the software. So this is the sense of comfort, the attachment, the identity, the things that you can't really plan necessarily. How do you get these things right? This is what makes a great place. And everyone here in West End, you know, this is what you guys have in bucketfuls. And this is why West End feels very different to, say, Docklands in Melbourne, is because Docklands hasn't got the software yet. It's got the hardware. The buildings might be great. It might tick all the urban design boxes. But how do you actually get that software in there? And so if you think about it, you know, hardware without software might win all sorts of design awards, but might never be used. Software without hardware actually tends to work much better. All you have to do is try and, you know, buy some food from a roadside vendor in Vietnam or something like that, and it's a really compelling place that you want to hang out in and you want to be in. Of course, there's all sorts of problems as well that come with no hardware. But what about the balance? How do we get both things in there, and how do we plan cities that have both of these? This is a Melbourne laneway. And so when you then think about these two components in the sense of social isolation, the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence do lots of, which are a Melbourne-based research group, do a lot of really interesting work in researching social exclusion. And when you look at their indicators of what causes loneliness and causes social isolation, one of them is about the hardware, quality of neighbourhoods, but all the rest are about the software. It's about volunteering, it's about participating, it's about knowing your neighbours. And so we need to be thinking about both of these things if we're trying to make great urban places. So how do we get there? It's not necessarily easy, but I think there's a huge, you know, the fact that you're all here in this room tonight shows that there's the will, particularly in the South East Queensland community and certainly centrally to Brisbane, to have these conversations, which is the first step. So I've got, since we're here to talk about ideas, I'm putting out 3 ideas about how we might get to great places to tackle these issues. Finding community leadership. And that's a really important nuance I'm putting on those words. It's not about meetings like this. You know, we hold town hall meetings and what tends to happen is an adversarial relationship between the citizens and their authority and whatever dynamic that might be. And this isn't helpful. This doesn't, how do you have a proactive conversation in this kind of environment? Or even worse than this sort of meeting is this one that no one goes to. And the worst part of this picture is that it's easy to check the box of engagement and say, well, we had the meeting and 5 people came and they said the same things they say every time and nobody else cares. So it's okay to go ahead with whatever it is we were asking them about, and we've checked that box of engagement. But that's not engagement. This isn't democracy. This isn't how we behave as active citizens in important decision-making processes. And there's the NIMBY. So what I want to share, this is a project that we worked on down in Victoria for Hepburn Shire, which is if anyone knows, the beautiful, beautiful Victorian countryside around Daylesford and Hepburn Springs, really lovely area about 45 minutes from Melbourne. Really big ice problem, drug problem for youth. The towns there are very small, very far apart, impossible for kids to get around, big problems with you know, ice being made in those regional communities, and the police are dealing with all sorts of issues associated with that, really high high school dropout rates as well. And so we were engaged by Hepburn Shire Council to help them do a youth engagement strategy. And what they're currently doing is changing their skate parks to engage the youth. And they're building these amazing things that nobody's using. And like, this isn't working anymore. We're spending, you know, tens of thousands of dollars on each of these parks and they're not being used and the kids are still taking drugs. So what do we do? And so we went out there and decided to actually sit down and speak to as many as we can. And this is a difficult thing to do. It's hard to get kids to want to talk to you in a way that you know, them really sharing their ideas. And so we used a number of methods to do it. And what we learned from them is that we heard that they love their towns. They actually don't want to leave. There was a perception amongst the local council that everybody wants to move to Melbourne or Geelong or one of the biggest cities as soon as they leave high school, because that's what happens, but that they just can't wait to get out of Hepburn. But what we heard when we actually spoke to them is they're so proud to be from that area. They love all the environmental assets. They love all of the reasons the tourists go there. But because the businesses are set up for for tourists, they don't feel welcome in their own town centres. So the cafes don't want the kids hanging around after school, and they don't want to give out the Wi-Fi password to the kids, and little tiny things like that were really creating these social problems for these kids, which we heard when we spoke to them. And so what we realised is that we needed to try and put these kids in the driver's seat and say, if you want a youth strategy, we want your ideas about this. And the council were really worried to start with, because there was a big undercurrent of people wanting a heated pool that just, nobody swims in pools in Victoria, and they were trying to tell everyone that. And they all wanted this pool, outdoor heated pool, and couldn't afford it and all this. And so they didn't want to ask the community because they were worried the kids would just ask for this pool. And so we went out to the kids, we designed a program where we made it a competition, and we said there'll be 2 winners and they will win a $1,000 bursary towards making their idea happen. So that was about those kids having to be part of implementing their idea. And we went out to all the high schools and primary schools in the area, which wasn't many, and brought out giant letters and post-it notes and things and asked them for their ideas and got them to go online and submit their ideas via the online portal and then have their ideas voted on. And there were an estimated 2,000 kids within the demographic we were targeting in the municipality, and I think the target was to try and reach 10%, so 200 of them, get 200 ideas. And what happened, and we did pop-up events and went to where they are, went to the rugby games and things like that, and spoke to them and got their ideas. And over the period of time, we got 300 entries across the municipality, and that's a heat map of how many we got in each ward. And we got 1,800 votes on the ideas out of 2,000 kids in the area, or young people in the area, which was unprecedented participation. And the things that they asked for, and actually the winning idea, was the $1,000 was going to be put towards popcorn and beanbags for the library so that they can have movie nights there. And the funny thing about that idea is that the library already does movie nights, but they're not cool because they just show Frozen. That's what we heard about again and again. And so the teenagers don't want to watch Frozen. And so the kids have won that money, and they're buying the beanbags and now hosting their own movie night. And they're being, they're selling it, they're not paid for, but they're booking out every time because the kids are actually running it themselves. And the other initiatives we heard were about Wi-Fi and all sorts of other, actually very small initiatives that change those kids' world, but don't cost very much at all. And they're not skate parks. No skate parks and no public pools were even listed. So my second idea is about, let's think about implementation. And of course, I say this in the context that we're here to talk about a regional strategy. So that's one of the highest levels of strategy we can speak about. But we also need to be thinking about how those things hit the ground and how we implement them in a way that makes sense to communities. So we tend to get stuck in this strategic trap, and I love to use this slide. This is actually a master plan I designed about 8 years ago and won some awards for, and nothing's been built, and it's the strategic trap of the award-winning on-the-shelf report. So how do we think about things in a different way? And particularly in my role speaking to communities, people are sick of saying the same things again and again and then just seeing more reports and it doesn't hit the ground in the same way. And so how do we fix that, or how do we deliver things that make sense to the community? So, every now, out of these strategies, we build places, and this is what I said before, and then we go through this process of trying to fix them, and this is called placemaking. And then we also might activate things, which is that, why are we in this situation where we're trying to fix all these brand new places that we're building? So what if we thought about different timescales for delivery? Rather than always thinking about the 50-year implementation, how do we get there? What if we were just transforming a space for an hour? What would we do? And when we're here talking about city making, an hour seems like a ridiculous time frame. But if you were to ask a local trader how they would improve their street for an hour, they'd have lots of ideas, because that's the type of timescale they work in. What if we were thinking about a weekend? What could we do in a weekend? And equally a summer. If we wanted to test an idea or create change for a summer, for a season, what could we do in those kind of timescales? And that's the lived experience of the city. That's what makes a difference to everybody in this room, is these kind of timescales. So an example of this in action is a project we worked on in a middle ring suburb in Melbourne, called St Albans. And there's a really diverse sort of cultural background groups in there, lots of Samoan, Fijians, Indians, Vietnamese, Chinese, lots of really, really interesting new immigrants to the area. And in the centre there, the green roof you can see is a substation. It's not a building. And around it is the world's most hectic, horrible bus interchange. So there, the bus stops sort of right in the centre of the road there. So it's sort of take your life in your hands when you're running it across the road to get on the bus. And the train station's being rebuilt, so the buses are moving, and council would like to create, this is a retail strip, create some sort of public space in that location to act as, you know, a mixing ground for all of these different people and groups that are in this area. And the traders just want more car parking in that area. And so what we did was we worked with some local people, so a principal from the school, one of the policemen, some traders, a couple of council representatives, a whole lot of different people within the community, and we gave them a whole lot of ideas of temporary activation. And we said that, you know, this is what we can achieve. I think the budget was $1,000 or something. This is what we could achieve. You've got this space for a weekend. The whole of that bus station is going to be shut down for one whole weekend. What do you want to do with it? What do you already have in your community that should be here? Who should be using this space and how? And they could have turned it into car parking, but they didn't. Instead, what they did is some of this is just infrastructure from the council, but they shut it down, turned it into a plaza, begged, borrowed, and just begged and borrowed some. It's being recorded, right? Some materials from all sorts of places, and all the traders who previously had been saying, oh no, it needs to be more car parking, they were bringing out their tables and chairs and wanting to be part of it, and it was a horrible, wet, freezing, it was about 3 degrees this day. And they created this space, and this is handmade bunting on the ground that's getting strung up on bamboo poles. And we grabbed old tyres from the road landfill. Great idea, except when you do that, tyres are really dirty. So you've got to have someone who's prepared to clean them off for you. These kids were happy to, which was great, lucky us. And they were painted up and turned into planter boxes. And what ended up being pulled together was not only this sort of rapid space transformation for virtually no money, with about 30 people helping out, but an incredible program of events and activities through this space, which was just, the participants just did a shout out to their networks, and we paid for an amp and a mic, and we had, so you've got the girls have jumpers on while they're dancing because it was so cold. And so there was music blaring out. We had 3 different types of Bollywood dance, and we had Sri Lankan dancers. They got themselves in the front of the newspaper 2 days before, the little girls. We had Fijian dancers, Samoan dancing, all sorts of things. And the street completely came alive. There were about 250 people in this space, and it wasn't us that created it. We just set up the enabling environment for it to happen. And they'd said that this wouldn't happen, that there was no need for this, and the community wouldn't have it in them really to take over this space. And now that's created a momentum for what this public space might be, and now those people are engaged in a really proactive, positive discussion with the council about what that plaza might be. And it's not about granite finishes and high-end street furniture in this location. It's about how the community can continue to use it for events and things like that. And my third idea is about testing, and so testing things to build a better model. And so this initiative is one that that was mentioned in my introduction. It's an initiative called the Neighbourhood Project, which CoDesign Studio is running. It's being funded by the Maya Foundation, and applications just closed for our first round a couple of days ago. So what it is we want to create a movement of change where communities are able to create their own cities, to lead their own placemaking initiatives, which is small public realm improvement ideas, to create the software that's needed. And so through the 50 or so projects we've worked on in the 3 years that we've been an organisation, we tackle these tiny, annoying problems on every single project, like there's no precedent to take over that car parking space and turn it into a park, so we'll get a skip and put the skip there and do the park in the skip. And so what we want to do with this program is tackle these problems at a scale that allows us to address them systemically. So we want to help, Melbourne has 31 council areas in the space that you've got 4 here. So it's a really difficult conversation. There's a lot of small, challenges that pop up that are unique just to one, ward area of only 10,000 people. And so we want to tackle these problems at scale and try and really create an appetite for change in this space. So the Neighbourhood Project is about the 3 successful councils for this first 12-month pilot. will be participating in a year-long program of training where we're training up the council officers to enable the community to lead their own projects. By Christmas, each of those 3 councils will be helping their community deliver 3 projects in the ground by Christmas. Actually, the deadline's November. They have to be in by because no one goes outside unless it's summer in Melbourne, so that's when they're in. They're also getting participation in an online platform of open source tools and a network of peers to share their ideas with one another and find out how they can problem solve together. The online resource is also open to the public too. We want everybody to be participating in these things as well, whether it be in Victoria or across Australia, to look at the tools that are coming out of this initiative. And we've also got a bit of money on the table for each of those councils as well to help them get those projects in the ground. And sometimes people are saying $30,000, that's a lot for these tiny initiatives. Usually most of that money goes to traffic control and cleaning the street and all the barriers and things we're actually trying to get rid of through the process anyway. So hopefully that amount can necessarily go down over time. And so what the project is about is it's about taking these motherhood statements and turning them into something that you can action. It's an action plan for this stuff. You know, we're being promoted by the Resilient Melbourne initiative, which is a really exciting coup for us as part of their resilience strategy, looking at how to continue to keep Melbourne as the world's most livable city. If you haven't heard, 5th year in a row, we love to tell ourselves that. And as a Brisbaneite, I roll my eyes every time. And so, you know, the leaders are grappling with these things, and so what we're trying to offer them is a way to immediately skill up to create action in this space. And what we'll be doing with them is looking at, this is a real diagram my team created, actually when we were trying to figure out how to get a park in the street, the skip that we've mentioned, and we were looking at all the barriers that came up, a real diagram that of all the things that happened in that process of trying to get the park in the street that ended up just being a skip. So the program is about looking at these barriers and figuring out how we can de-risk the process and remove some of these. And we're doing that through a practical training program for the participating councils to help them do these projects themselves. It's also about changing the community discussion from this sort of frustrated discussion into something where we're able to mobilise those community members into being active in the change, which is what I've been speaking about already. And thirdly, it's about, most importantly in a way, it's about looking at underutilised land and communities identifying underutilised land, which isn't unused. It means it could have a better use, that there's a latent opportunity for that space to be used better, and transforming that into these well-loved community spaces. And only the local community knows what makes their own space well-loved. That is a locally ascribed value, and so it's not necessarily about beauty or about granite or about high-end finishes. It's about what people do and the sense of attachment they feel to their place. And so just because I knew the skip was going to be mentioned, I thought I'd put some of the photos up of it just to finish up. It's now, if you go to BuzzFeed and just Google Melbourne, it's on every BuzzFeed list about Melbourne hipsters gone mad. And so this is what happened with the skip is we, as you know, wanted to put a little parklet in the street and couldn't officially got a letter of refusal from the CEO of our local council saying, I paraphrase, it's never going to happen, stop hassling my officers. And then we realised that we could get a skip permit on the spot for $20 and the skip could be there for as long as we wanted it to be. So that's what we did. Skips are really expensive though, so it's $20 plus $1,000 for the skip. But anyway, we were making a point. And so we just set it up. We've got a whole storeroom full of astroturf and plants and seats and things like that. And we actually just needed a skip for a garage sale we were having. And we had a team lunch out the front because they're the really narrow footpaths and nowhere to sit in the sun. And it just so happened this photo was taken by a famous Instagrammer who happened to snap the photo while we were all sitting in there, and it went on Instagram and it was like, Collingwood hipsters reach new low eating lunch out of a skip, #skipsters. So that hashtag's still out there, that's ours, feel free to tweet that. And it keeps popping up all the time, which is amazing. But this is, we're using that frustration, that's what the Neighbourhood Project is about, it's about removing those barriers and creating opportunities for communities to do things themselves. Thank you.